I think you need a little bit more structure for your arguments. You've got a good presentation here of ideas and concepts, but you need to make more declarative sentences on a couple of things. The 2 or 3 things that were pretty clear. The first one is that we're violating our traditional views, and there's also another, right before that there's the argument that says we can't use this in criminal cases. Those need to be more clearly developed, and there needs to be a little bit more structure for them, especially that first one, because you kind of just are letting the evidence do the talking on that. Oh, by the way, Alex, there's one other thing I want to say. On your evidence, I didn't hear source citations. I often heard a reference to a source, somebody said, in some CIA document, but I'd never heard who it was. And there's one point where you quote a former president and you don't even identify who the former president is. Now, I happen to know who the former president is, but I can't. Why didn't you just say his name? And it just seems, well, let me see. Who could it be? Well, I know it's not Bush. I know it's not the other Bush. It's either Clinton or Carter. Clinton's mostly kept his mouth shut about these kinds of things. Okay, it's Jimmy Carter, just process of elimination. Was it Jimmy Carter? Yeah, okay, there you go. But why am I having to figure that kind of stuff out? You've got the citation there. You need to be citing that. So sorry about the sidetrack, getting off of what James was doing a second ago, but that's just something that I remembered here. But the Convention Against Torture, all the Demon Eva stuff, because he set that up and they never respond to it, that means that it's so much easier for you to make these arguments that says, on moral grounds, we're crossing a line here that we have said is unacceptable. We've said it on our own standards. We sign these agreements, so on and so forth. This is, again, where I think that there should be some response from the affirmative that says, yeah, these are agreements between nations and states. And in fact, James even uses those terms when he's talking about that, that states are agreeing not to do this. Well, guess what? Terrorists are not states. They are not nations. They are not accountable in the same ways that another government would be accountable for responsibility. Can we prosecute people for genocide if a whole country, makes it a policy to wipe out a certain class of people? We're going to gas them, we're going to shoot them all, that sort of thing. Well, then we've got genocide, and we can hold a country's government accountable for that. But if you've got random guy who blows up everybody that he encounters, who's accountable for that? Who do we drag before the World Court in that situation? That's not a place for the World Court to decide those things. That's why they aren't being charged in the front of the World Court. That's why they aren't being charged in U.S. courts, because we have this different system of justice for these kinds of acts. And I never heard any discussion of that from the affirmative. I think you needed to respond to those arguments a little bit more. All right, let me see. The idea that it would subject our military and civilians to similar kind of treatment, I think is interesting. If we were applying this, for instance, to soldiers on the field, we would definitely have that kind of problem. But you've got an easy answer to this, and it should come, and I think it does come up at one point, although it's not really applied on this argument, and that's real simple. These people don't observe any of these kinds of niceties. The idea that because we don't waterboard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed means that when Al-Qaeda captures an American soldier, they'll say, oh, we're not going to torture him because we know Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is not being tortured. These are the people who cut a reporter's head off and put it on YouTube, a guy who had nothing to do with any of the military, who was there to cover the story and was basically killed because he was a Jew who had the audacity to ask questions. And those are the people that you think are going to be deterred from or honor these criteria? I think that's kind of a laughable argument to be making on this point. And that's the way you ought to be portraying it, that they're making claims here that sound like they've got the high moral ground, but it ignores the reality. And I think you do say that at one point, that we have to look at things, not in the context of this, artificial black and white. We've got to look at the world that we actually live in. And I think that argument needs to come up a little bit more on the affirmative side. All right. In the rebuttals, a lot of issues just kind of get pushed to the side. Alex, you kind of get on this issue about the one terrorist who's waterboarded 83 times. you know, so clearly it wasn't working. Although at one point you say it wasn't until the 83rd time that he finally gave up the piece of data. The first thing I would have said if I was the affirmative is, yeah, and what was that piece of data? Did it make a difference in, you know, saving somebody's life? You know, the previous 82 times that he got waterboarded, that set him up for the 83rd, and we got the information that we needed. You know, and it still isn't torture, you know, to defend this position. But I think that you've got a good argument that you're making there that suggests, how effective can it be if we have to do it over and over and over and over and over again? There's nothing, you know, it's not working. And I thought you had another good argument here. This might have actually been something that could have been brought up as a disadvantage by James, and that is that we can't really trust the guidelines. The affirmative is saying we're using them only for high-value targets. They're very controlled circumstances. Well, apparently that's not true, because we know we got a couple of guys who died in some mud pit in Afghanistan because they were left out overnight. And you know, that's an example of something that we definitely don't want to have happening. And it happens because people think that the enhanced interrogation techniques are acceptable for them to use. I don't know if anybody is prosecuted on that. I think that would be one of those things where, you know, if that happened in Afghanistan and it was done by somebody who is not in the CIA doing this and an untrained person, were there consequences on this? I think that's one of the things that if the affirmative knew anything about that, that would be a good response to make. That, you know, somebody lost their job or they were punished or they rewrote the rules based on that experience. That would be, especially if it was an early experience. It sounds like it happened, you know, in the jail, you know, during the wars, you know, right when we were in Afghanistan at first. I don't know. I don't remember if there was a date on that. So it might have even happened. See, that's another one of those things. It might have even happened before the enhanced interrogation techniques were authorized for use in 2003 that you guys had, you know, a response on in a couple of other places. So this is all, you know, looking at it from a distance. I know that you guys are looking at it and trying to deal with it as it's going on. I'm just, you know, the outsider telling you how I'm processing information. Kirsty, I think that you needed to respond to James's arguments more directly. You spent a lot of time on stuff that was talked about on the case issue again, about the effectiveness of these techniques and so on and so forth. And all the stuff about it being torture, about the moral problem, about whether or not it would be, you know, our own soldiers or civilians would be subjected to these kinds of behaviors, about whether or not our leaders or our diplomats could be put into trial someplace around the world. You don't really say anything about those kinds of things. And those arguments get left on the table, potentially very damaging. Now, as it turns out, they're not all that damaging because James pretty much leaves them on the table too. He doesn't really come back to those arguments. That's the first thing I think I would have done if I was the second negative. I'd say, okay, well, what did the affirmative say about this moral standard on universal application of morality? Nothing. All right? So would we want to have this done to our people? The answer is no. The affirmative apparently agrees. So we really don't have a good justification for doing this from a moral point of view. We can't prosecute them in American courts. You did extend that argument. So that was one of those points that you did, you know, make a point about. I think you should point out that they didn't say anything about it originally before you spoke. Oh. I got no answer from them on that particular issue. I got an answer from Alex in the second affirmative rebuttal after you've had your last chance to speak. But, you know, my last chance to speak, I said this is a problem. The affirmative hasn't said anything about this. This is a problem. We have no way of doing, you know, taking care of these people. Now, I think you give the right answer when you finally get to it, and that is prosecuting them is not what we're looking for when we do this. We're looking for information to save lives. You know, going to court is the least of our worries, and the truth of the matter is those people can be dealt with, and this is where I think you need to have a little bit more information on that whole background about what's going on. They're not really going to be prosecuted in U.S. courts. They started to do that, and then they said, you know, we're not, it was like time out. We're not going to do that anymore. And you guys have the evidence on that that says that, you know, they tossed the cases out, and, you know, the prosecutor is not allowed to go forward, and the judge says you can't use any of this information. Well, that's because you're talking about civilian courts in the United States where absolutely that stuff's going to be excluded. But that's where you guys should be able to come back and say, well, the truth of the matter is, when it comes to punishing these people, they shouldn't be punished by U.S. courts for actions that they took someplace else, even if it did result in consequences here. These are terrorists, they're foreign military operatives, they should be prosecuted by these special military courts that were set up for doing that. The Supreme Court ruled originally that the courts weren't constituted correctly. We've adjusted that, so they are now constituted in a particular way, and we can prosecute them there as a result of that. So there's more information that's not gotten into this that you need to have a little bit more on. On the other hand, you did have some good arguments, again, talking about how they've been effective at protecting us. You do have some argument on this moral standard. Other countries are doing it, it's not that big a deal, and the truth is other countries do far worse than us, and they never get prosecuted. I think that's the argument that you make on these diplomats. 1/3 of countries around the world are, using techniques like this. Those people are not being hauled in front of a court every time, the president or the prime minister of Israel appears someplace, or Tony Blair or David Cameron or whoever is the prime minister of Great Britain goes someplace, and certainly they aren't arresting Mubarak or Prince Fayed or whoever the president of Pakistan is, and those kinds of things. This idea that suddenly they're all going to come after us, and Bush and Rumsfeld are going to have to worry about going to Paris for Disney World or something like that. That's not really something that's a legitimate argument there. All right. And then and then Alex, I think you had several good arguments at the end. Some of them came a little bit later. But you want to reemphasize again the significance issue. Because the moral argument needed a stronger answer, I think you're in a harder position at the end, and you just you keep harping on the preventive sort of thing, and I think that that's the reasonable option to take there.